Hello, so this session focuses on writing a research report. So this could be for a dissertation, for a project, for a journal article. Very similar sort of pattern follows, although if you're writing a journal article, we don't typically call them chapters, but they would be different sections. Now, this should be listened to in conjunction with a recording that I've done on writing an introduction, aim and objectives, and also recordings I've produced on literature review, writing methodology, and also writing up quantitative findings and writing up qualitative findings. So as you can see from the slide on the screen, there's a number of key sections or chapters that you would typically have in a research report. So obviously you've got your title, but you'll have an abstract, which I'll explain in a moment, contents page, and then, generally 5 main chapters, although they could be broken up into more than one chapter in some instances, particularly if they're longer and depending on the style you're writing. And then this is finished with some references and finally your appendices. So if we have a look at what you would put in an abstract, so if you've been doing some research for your dissertation, you'll have been looking at journal articles, and they always have an abstract, which is typically anything from about 100 words up to about 300 words. That would be quite long for a journal article. You've got a little bit more scope in a dissertation to write them a little bit longer. And typically you want to write 1 to 3 sentences in each of the following. So first of all, you need to set some context about your study, basically tell people what it's about. Explain the rationale for the study, so that is why it's worth studying. And then you need to explain the methodology that's used, identify some key findings, and briefly state the implications of those findings. So if you're not sure really how one of these should look, I would have a look at a number of different kind of journal articles and look at journal articles in different journals and think about the things they cover. They don't always cover all of these things, but they will give you a good idea of what you're aiming for and the style you're aiming for. And then in terms of chapters 1 to 3, so if I just go back there, that's the introduction, literature review and methodology. Have a look at separate recordings that I've done on those areas. So if we jump straight to chapter 4, which is typically a results, a discussion of findings or analysis chapter. So there's lots of different terms there because it can be called different things, and a lot depends how you put it together, and more on that in a moment. But, usually this is quite a long chapter, and it's, an important chapter, the most important chapter, because this is where you're telling your reader all about what you've actually found and presenting your data. So sometimes it can be more than one chapter, and one of the things you need to do is go beyond the descriptive and be analytical. So have a look at what I've one of my recordings on critical analysis. So I've done something on critical analysis in the literature review, but also I will mention some things under the recordings that I've done on presenting qualitative findings and presenting quantitative findings. Often, particularly in a quantitative study, it's separated into results and discussions. This is where there might be more than one chapter. So there are various options. So on the left-hand side here, you can see that if you're doing quantitative studies, it's quite common to present your results first of all and then discuss them. So the results section is pretty much the factual information about those results. And then the discussion is really what they mean. But you can also combine them together, and I typically combine results and discussion because I find it quite hard to discuss my results without actually talking, without actually referring back to the results all the time. So I quite like to wrap them together. And you might call that analysis. Okay, so, you can, these different names, it's not, essential they're called particular things. So, talk about this with a supervisor if you're unsure. Now, in qualitative studies, typically we present our results and discuss them together because qualitative findings are a little bit different to quantitative findings. So often the terminology is different as well. So here I've suggested you might call it a findings chapter or an analysis chapter. And then in your conclusion, you need to be very selective here. You mustn't go and repeat everything that you've already just said. So you need to highlight the key results. And one thing that's really quite key is to make sure you address your research objectives. So have a look at your introduction chapter. What did you say you were going to do in your introduction chapter? What did you say you were trying to find out? What do your objectives say? And actually try to make sure you address that, because people should be able to read your introduction and then read your conclusion and understand everything about your project. Other things you can do in your conclusion that I'd recommend you include: identify limitations. And limitations, I don't mean, I could have sent out more questionnaires. You can talk about that in your methodology chapter, or I should have done more interviews. But identify limitations in terms of, well, the study found this, but actually, it's now become apparent that X is important and X hasn't really been covered. So you often uncover things in the course of your dissertation that you realise are actually quite important, but you haven't really got enough data on them. So identify those kinds of limitations here, and then suggest areas for further research that might take that forward. And you might suggest areas of further research from other key findings that you have. And then make some recommendations for industry or practice. What could industry learn from this? What could government agencies learn from this? How might this change things? That's what you want to think about there. Then you'll have your references. Now, these are references, not a bibliography. A bibliography is something different. What we're interested in is your references, what you've read and used in your report, not what you've looked at and might have used. So what needs to be in your list of references is anything that you've cited in the text, and they should match each other. So if I see a citation in the text, a reference to Brown 2016, I should find it in your reference list. And similarly, if I look at your reference list and I see Jones 2020, I should be able to find Jones 2020 in your dissertation. So use the BU Harvard Reference System Guide, and you can find this on the Brightspace Study Skills tab. And then the final section is your appendices. Now, don't just chuck random material in here. You usually include a copy of your research instrument. So if you designed a questionnaire, put a copy of the questionnaire in there. If you've used interviews, put a copy of your interview schedule in there. Sometimes you might include some more detailed analysis that's not in your analysis chapter. So there might be some background material that people might want to look at, but you're not going to put in your analysis chapter because it's too long. So, for example, you've done a questionnaire and you've got some open-ended questions. You might want to put the answers to those open-ended questions in there, or possibly some of the groupings that you've put together from that. And then you're going to just report a summary in your analysis chapter. Typically, if you've done qualitative research, you want to include one interview or one focus group transcript, which can be coded if you want, but doesn't have to be. You don't need to include data that's not utilised or supportive of the report, so don't just randomly chuck everything else you have in there. It needs to be things that are relevant, because anything in the appendices does need to be referred to in your text, so it needs a kind of quick link, to sort of say, further detail on the open answers to open-ended questions can be found in Appendix 2. And therefore number any tables so that actually you can refer to them in the text. So either give it Appendix 2 or Appendix 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, something like that. And, then people can go and look at things if they need to. Then a few notes about writing. So we want to write in the third person. So I've got some examples there of what not to do. So not I sent out the questionnaire. And also the other thing that students often do is the author or the researcher sent out questionnaires. It's the same sort of thing. So instead you want to use the questionnaires were sent out. And you only need to refer to the research if it's something particular about you. So, I've got the example there of the researcher had volunteered with the organisation and therefore knew whatever, because that's where you actually do need to mention, the role of the researcher. So avoid things like we and our, you and your, and ours too. Okay. And then there's various slightly different language depending on whether you're writing something that's quantitative or qualitative. So in quantitative studies, we tend to refer to respondents, so people who've completed a questionnaire, the results, hypothesis and research questions, reliability and validity. Whereas if we're doing qualitative research, we tend to talk about participants. We tend to talk about findings, and we have research questions. We don't have hypotheses. And reliability and validity are not applicable, so we'll talk about things like trustworthiness. So think about that slightly different use of language. Okay, so now go and have a look at some of my other recordings that relate to writing up.